I am Gwyneth Harold Davidson, and it is my pleasure to read for Ananse Soundsplash 2021. I'll be reading from my young adult novel, Young Heroes of the Caribbean, and there's a short story inside called Sam Sharpe's story, Grant True Wisdom. I'll begin. Sitting on his horse, Bakra Lynch smiled broadly, watching the fight with interest and enjoyment. On the stubby grass at the end of Low Gate cane piece, two small boys were struggling on the ground in a fierce wrestle. They were both small and skinny, but the tense grit of their teeth and the rough handling of each other spoke of the intensity of their battle. At that moment, Sam had the advantage, as he had pressed Cicero to the ground and was kneeling with his elbow pressed into the other boy's ribs. Despite his pain, Cicero managed to get his leg hooked into Sam's supporting knee and gave it the hardest jerk he could. Sam cried out in pain as his ankle twisted and he reached out to hold it. Cicero jumped on him and pummeled the boy's face hard. Sam managed to grab an arm and bit down hard on Cicero's wrist. But at that point, a pair of thick arms dislodged the two and bore a crying Sam Sharpe away. Annoyed that his sport had been taken away, Bakra nevertheless allowed Curtis, the plantation's biggest and strongest worker, to carry the boy from the angry scene. Bakra Lynch instinctively looked around and his eyes met those of the cart driver, Daddy Servius, the oldest worker on the plantation and the only African-born enslaved person. Bakra Lynch knew that he had given Curtis the order to part the boys, so he left the matter and rode away. That evening in the village, the mothers of the boys had it out with each other in a loud tracing match. Cicero's mother pointed to the scar on her son's wrist caused by the wicked beast Sam, and Sam's mother said that her boy was probably lamed for life because of that thieving snake. No one tried to interrupt them. It was a way of letting off steam and letting go some of the venom that built up daily in estate life. The following morning, Sam's ankle was swollen, and his mother pleaded with the headman that he get some days off for treatment at the hospital. And he agreed, and Daddy Servius transported the boy there that day. Later, as he sat with his back against the cool stones of the hospital foundation, Sam tried to make sense of how things turned out the way they did. Cicero was his best friend, so how did they end up in that terrible fight? They were both picking up short stalks of cane left behind in the fields and running jokes with each other. It was their game to have a competition with each other as to who would have the highest pile before Daddy Servius came with a cart to collect cane for the boiler house. This time, however, when Sam returned from picking up, there was one pile instead of two, and each boy claimed it as his own. Sam threw a verbal taunt at Cicero, and Bakra, who was nearby, laughed and said that Cicero would serve Sam forever. Cicero hit Sam, who then punched him, and that is how the fight with his best friend started. The slave hospital was on its own little hillside far from the factory. It was made of dark-colored cut stone and was cool inside. Fields of cane lands rustled and waved down the slopes from the hospital, and at the bottom of the nearby valley, a thick grove of trees sheltered a small river that eventually led to the village where the estate enslaved persons lived. Sam counted the backs of all the workers that he could see in the fields. He went through all his fingers and his toes about 3 times. He saw his parents, his uncles and cousins and neighbors, and then he counted the overseers. He could count all of them on one hand. Then he looked for the sole man on horseback, Bakra Lynch. He thought that Bakra Lynch must be very powerful for him, one man, to have so much control over so many people. Sam spent 3 days there, watching the workers receive painful treatments for awful injuries. Most of the patients who came to the hospital were there because of accidents in the fields or in the factory rather than to illness. Sam was soon glad to be home, and as soon as his mother stopped fussing over him, Sam limped to Cicero's family house. He found his friend sitting on his doorstep. Cicero was, as usual, holding the old book that had been in their village for as long as they knew. Cicero was slowly moving his index finger from left to right along a line of black and white markings on a page in the book. He had been teaching himself to read. "Hey, Bookman," Sam said and sat beside Cicero. His pet name for his friend was Bookman because he spent most of his spare time looking into that one book. "Hey, Sam," Cicero replied with a grateful grin now that he knew that they were still friends. "Brah," said a voice. It sounded like a call. Daddy Servius was standing at the path leading away from the village, beckoning to them. He had some curious ways, the old African, and one of them is that he often spoke to them in his mother tongue, which none of them knew. They followed him away from the houses where the earth was hard from being constantly pounded by footsteps in the village, and he took them to the side of the road where they normally left produce for Sunday market. The ground there at the side of the road had a lot of loose dust. Daddy Servius made sure that they were paying attention to him. Then he used a slim piece of bamboo and drew in the dust. "That's a crocodile," said Sam. "Live like the crocodile, Sam, and adapt," said Daddy Servius. "And that is the web of Ananse," said Cicero. Daddy Servius said, "Spider, small, weak animal, but the spider's web is very strong. The spider uses it to go in all directions to survive. The web teaches us that we must learn to see the options, the opportunities that are always around us." "What are you teaching us, Daddy Servius?" Sam wanted to know. Daddy Servius said, "Bakra is the only one on the plantation who uses books. He values them above all of his other possessions because it gives him power. Cicero is already learning that, Sam. He is truly living the special name that you have for him, Bookman. I say to you both, learn the power of the book and of the web, and you will have greater power." That's the end of my short story about Sam Sharpe in my book, The Young Heroes of the Caribbean, Common Destiny. It was my pleasure participating in Ananse Soundsplash 2021.